read one book a day, and tonight we're diving into Bleak House. We all fear being drained, fearing that a long wait will ultimately end in nothingness, and that our sincerity and kindness will be no match for the complexities of reality. This work, written by Dickens in 1852, is like a mirror, reflecting the anxiety and confusion deep in each of our hearts, as well as the absurdity and sorrow of an era. As Dickens' longest magnum opus of critical realism, set against the backdrop of London's thick fog, it weaves together the fates of countless people through a generation-spanning inheritance lawsuit, holding the struggles and redemption that each of us can understand. It's perfect to listen to and savor slowly on this quiet night. The core of the story revolves around an inheritance lawsuit known as Jarndyce and Jarndyce, a lawsuit that, like an invisible net, traps everyone involved, leaving them unable to break free. Let's start with Esther Summerson, a kind, forbearing girl who always carries a hint of inferiority. She is the gentle backdrop of the entire story, and the key that connects all the threads. Esther was an orphan from childhood. She didn't know who her parents were, only that she was raised by her aunt. Her aunt never showed her any affection. In fact, she often whispered in her ear that she was a child who shouldn't have been born and a burden. Growing up in such an environment, Esther learned to please and endure from an early age. She didn't dare to ask for much, only hoping that through her own efforts, she could be useful and accepted by others. She carefully hid her emotions, burying all her grievances and anxieties deep in her heart. Even when misunderstood, she rarely defended herself. She was afraid that her existence would trouble others, and even more afraid that her background would make others look down on her. It wasn't until her aunt passed away that Esther was sent to live with John Jarndyce, becoming his ward and a companion to Ada Clare and Richard Carston. John Jarndyce was a member of the Jarndyce family and one of the parties involved in the inheritance lawsuit, but he was different from everyone else. He abhorred this endless lawsuit and the people consumed by greed. He was kind, upright, and had a soft heart. By John Jarndyce's side, Esther felt warmth and kindness for the first time. He didn't disdain her background, didn't criticize her clumsiness. Instead, he encouraged and respected her, making her understand that she was not a burden and that she was worthy of being loved. At that moment, hope ignited in Esther's heart for the first time. She thought she could finally escape the shadows of her past and start a new life. She worked hard to take care of Ada and Richard, managed John Jarndyce's estate, and did everything to perfection. She even secretly hoped that she might have a happiness of her own, and that her background might no longer be an unspeakable secret. But little did she know, fate had already laid a hidden trap. Her background was not only tied to her own destiny, but also to a hidden past in high society. And all of this was inextricably linked to that absurd inheritance lawsuit. Unlike Esther's forbearance, Richard Carstone, a young boy, was caught up in the inheritance lawsuit from the very beginning, drifting step by step toward destruction. Like Ada, Richard was one of the beneficiaries of the Jarndyce inheritance. From a very young age, someone had told him that if the lawsuit was won, he would receive a huge inheritance and live a life of endless luxury and wealth. It was this expectation that planted a seed of greed in his heart, making him obsessed with the lawsuit from childhood. When he first came to live with John Jarndyce, Richard was a vibrant young man full of longing for the future. He fell in love with Ada, and they accompanied each other. At that moment, he might have understood that happiness was not just about a huge inheritance, but also about the people around him. But every time someone mentioned the lawsuit, every time someone spoke of the wealth that was soon to be his, the greed in his heart would swell infinitely. He became impetuous and anxious, no longer willing to study hard, no longer cherishing the love beside him. His entire mind was focused on the lawsuit. He always thought that if he waited a little longer, if he persisted a little more, the lawsuit would be won. He would rise to the top in one step, and he could give Ada a better life. He began to visit lawyers frequently to inquire about the progress of the lawsuit, spending a great deal of time and money, even borrowing money from others. John Jarndyce tried to persuade him repeatedly, telling him that the lawsuit was a bottomless pit and not worth exhausting himself over. But Richard refused to listen. He had been dazzled by greed. He was unwilling to believe that the thing he had pursued for so long was nothing but emptiness. He stubbornly thought that John Jarndyce was jealous of him and didn't want him to get the inheritance. He began to distance himself from John Jarndyce, from Esther, and even from Ada, the one he loved most. Deep down, he did struggle. Every night when he was alone, he might have remembered that his original dream was not wealth, but to live a quiet and happy life with Ada. But every time there was a glimmer of progress in the lawsuit, every time a lawyer told him, "Just hold on a little longer and you'll win," he would fall back into the vortex of greed, unable to extricate himself. He was afraid of failure, afraid that all his efforts would be in vain, afraid that he couldn't give Ada a better life, and even more afraid that he would be seen as a failure by others. This mixture of fear and greed eroded his sanity little by little and drained his vitality bit by bit. He became decadent and depressed, and his health grew worse and worse, but he still refused to give up the lawsuit. In the end, the lawsuit finally came to an end. The so-called victory was nothing but an absurd joke. All the inheritance had been consumed by high legal fees. He not only got no money at all, but also incurred huge debts, leaving him physically and mentally exhausted, on the verge of collapse. In his final moments, he might have finally understood that the thing he had chased all his life was nothing but emptiness, and that the warmth and happiness he had ignored were long gone. He closed his eyes with endless regret, and the absurd lawsuit claimed another innocent victim. If Richard was an ordinary person consumed by greed, then Lady Dedlock was the epitome of hypocrisy and pain in high society. She was a noble, elegant lady with enviable status and wealth, married into the prestigious Dedlock family as Sir Leicester Dedlock's wife. In everyone's eyes, she was happy and enviable, but only she knew how much unspeakable pain and secrets lay behind this seemingly glorious life. Her heart was never truly happy. Although Sir Leicester Dedlock was wealthy and noble, he was rigid and cold. He never loved Lady Dedlock herself. He only loved her status and the glory she could bring to the Dedlock family. Between them, there was no love, no warmth, only cold etiquette and false politeness. In such a marriage, Lady Dedlock lived like a puppet, wearing a mask every day, playing the role of a perfect lady, suppressing all her emotions and desires. The deepest secret in her heart was that she had an illegitimate daughter. none other than Esther. Many years ago, when she was young and beautiful, she fell in love with an army officer named Captain Horden. But this relationship was not allowed in high society at that time. It was a disgrace. For her own reputation and the family's glory, she had to give up the relationship and her daughter, entrusting her to her own sister, Esther's aunt. All these years, she had kept this secret hidden in her heart, not daring to tell anyone, not even her closest relatives. She was afraid that the secret would be exposed, that she would be ruined, and that she would lose everything she had. But fate was cruel. An inheritance lawsuit that seemed to have nothing to do with her accidentally uncovered the secret she had hidden for so many years. That day, while handling legal documents related to the lawsuit, she accidentally saw Captain Horden's handwriting, a handwriting etched in her heart, a mark she would never forget. At that moment, her heart almost stopped beating, and fear and panic swept over her instantly. She knew that as long as someone found this handwriting, as long as someone dug deeper, her secret would be made public and her life would collapse completely. She became anxious and restless, unable to calm down all day, even afraid to face those legal documents and the people around her. She tried hard to hide her panic, but the subtle changes were still noticed by the cold and greedy lawyer, Tulkinghorn. Tulkinghorn was the lawyer for the Dedlock family. He was shrewd, cold, and only cared about profit, not human feelings. He noticed Lady Dedlock's abnormality and sensed the secret she was hiding. He began to investigate secretly, trying to grasp this secret to blackmail Lady Dedlock and control everything about her. Lady Dedlock sensed Tulkinghorn's intentions, and her fear grew deeper and deeper. She knew that Tulkinghorn was a man who would stop at nothing. As long as he held her secret, he would blackmail her endlessly until he squeezed out all her value. She didn't want to be bound by this secret anymore, didn't want to be blackmailed by Tulkinghorn, and even more, didn't want her secret to be made public, bringing shame to herself and her daughter. At that moment, she had the idea of escaping this cold home, escaping this hypocritical high society, escaping all the fear and pain. On a cold night, Lady Dedlock changed into plain clothes and secretly left home. She didn't know where she was going or where she could go. She just wanted to escape, to find a place where no one knew her, to spend the rest of her life quietly. But it was freezing cold, and she had no money. She wandered aimlessly, suffering a lot along the way. She thought of her daughter, Esther, of all the pain and struggles she had endured over the years, of the relationship she had given up. Her heart was filled with regret and despair. She knew that she had lived her entire life in hypocrisy and pain, never truly living for herself. In the end, she froze to death in a cold church cemetery, ending her painful and hypocritical life. It was not until her death that her secret was completely uncovered. When Esther learned of her background, she felt no resentment or complaint. She understood her mother's pain and helplessness and forgave her mother's choice back then. She knew that her mother's life was also a victim of the times and social etiquette, just like countless women of that era, powerless to control her own fate. In this absurd inheritance lawsuit, many others became innocent victims. Joe, an orphan from the slums, was one of them. Joe had nothing, no family, no home, wandering the streets every day begging for a living. He was innocent and kind, but he was drawn into this turmoil because he accidentally learned Lady Dedlock's secret. To cover up the secret, Tulkinghorn sent people to hunt down Joe, who was forced to flee everywhere, suffering untold hardships. He didn't understand why, as an innocent child, he was drawn into such a complicated dispute, why he had to live such a painful life. In the end, Joe died of poverty and illness. His life was as insignificant as dust. No one cared about his life or death, and no one remembered that he had ever come to this world. Then there was Tulkinghorn, a cold and greedy lawyer. He spent his entire life chasing profit, controlling the fates of others by any means, thinking he could control everything. But in the end, he was betrayed by his own greed and murdered in his office. He never understood until his death that wealth and power were never eternal. Blindly chasing profit would only lead to destruction. And John Jarndyce, the kind and upright squire, always kept his original intention. He abhorred this absurd lawsuit and the people consumed by greed. He took in Esther, Ada, and Richard, giving them warmth and kindness, trying to use his own strength to save those trapped by the lawsuit. But his power was ultimately insignificant. He couldn't change the rigid and corrupt judicial system, couldn't save those consumed by greed. He could only watch helplessly as Richard drifted toward destruction, as Lady Dedlock died a tragic death, and as the absurd lawsuit drained the hope of everyone involved. His heart was filled with powerlessness and sorrow, but he still didn't give up his kindness, still adhered to his bottom line, and used his own way to warm the people around him, spreading a glimmer of light. Esther's life was also full of hardships. She was abandoned and neglected as a child, enduring countless grievances and sufferings. When she grew up, she learned of her background and was drawn into an absurd turmoil. But she was never defeated by hardship. She always maintained her kindness, forbearance, and strength, warming the people around her with her gentleness and goodwill. She took care of Ada, accompanied Richard, and comforted John Jarndyce. Even when she suffered grievances, she still chose kindness. She was once inferior because of her background, once confused because of the hardships of fate. But in the end, she found her direction and her own happiness. She fell in love with Dr. Woodcourt, and with John Jarndyce's blessing, they formed their own family and started a new life. Her experience tells us that no matter how rough fate is, no matter how many hardships we endure, as long as we adhere to kindness and hope, we will surely get out of the darkness and usher in the light. The inheritance lawsuit, known as Jarndyce and Jarndyce, dragged on for decades, consuming countless people's time, money, and lives. In the end, it ended with an absurd victory. There were no winners, only endless pain and regret. This lawsuit was like a mirror, reflecting the greed, hypocrisy, and selfishness of human nature, as well as the absurdity and morbidity of that era. It was not just an inheritance lawsuit, but a profound criticism of the Victorian judicial system and a profound reflection on the entire society. With his delicate writing, Dickens portrayed vivid characters whose struggles, pain, greed, and kindness were all displayed incisively and vividly. He did not deliberately beautify human nature, nor did he deliberately criticize anyone. He only told sad and absurd stories from an objective perspective, allowing us to see the complexity of human nature, the cruelty of the times, and the power of hope in the stories. when the truth of the Jarndyce and Jarndyce inheritance lawsuit was revealed, when all the inheritance was consumed by legal fees, and when those consumed by greed fell one by one toward destruction, we have to stop and think, what exactly did this absurd lawsuit devour? It was people's time, money, and lives, and even more so, their sanity, kindness, and hope. The root of all this was not only the rigid and corrupt judicial system, but also the greed and desire deep in human nature. In Bleak House, Dickens used an absurd lawsuit to expose the social morbidity of the Victorian era, the cumbersome, slow, and corrupt chancery, the hypocrisy, coldness, and intrigue of high society, and the suffering, helplessness, and exploitation of the lower classes. But this work is not just a criticism of an era. It is a profound exploration of the common predicament of humanity and a profound analysis of human nature. To this day, this work still has profound practical significance, and the issues it explores still play out in our lives. How many people around us, like Richard, are consumed by greed, blindly chasing wealth, power, and fame, thinking that these things can bring happiness and stability? In the end, they exhaust their time, energy, and enthusiasm, miss the warmth and happiness around them, and end up with nothing. We always think that as long as we have enough wealth, we can have happiness. As long as we have enough power, we can gain respect. But we forget that wealth and power are never the whole of happiness. Blindly chasing desire will only make us lose ourselves and fall into endless emptiness and confusion. Just like Richard, he never understood until his death that what he really wanted was never a huge inheritance, but a quiet and happy life with Ada. But when he understood this, it was already too late. How many people around us, like Lady Dedlock, are bound by etiquette and the world, living with a mask, suppressing their emotions and desires, not daring to pursue what they really want, and finally spending their lives in hypocrisy and pain. We always care about the opinions of others, are afraid of being looked down on, and always want to meet the standards of the world and live a decent life. But we forget that true decency is never about external status and wealth, but about inner peace and freedom. Lady Dedlock had enviable status and wealth, but she was never truly happy because she always lived in secrets and fear, never living for herself. Her tragedy was not only a personal tragedy, but also a tragedy of the times, the oppression and destruction of human nature by etiquette. Esther's existence is like a beam of light in the dark, telling us, no matter how rough fate is, no matter how many hardships we endure, as long as we adhere to kindness and hope, we will surely get out of the darkness and usher in the light. Esther was abandoned and neglected as a child, enduring countless grievances and sufferings, but she was never defeated by hardship. She always maintained her kindness, forbearance, and strength, warming the people around her with her gentleness and goodwill. She did not resent because of her background, nor did she feel confused because of the hardships of fate. Instead, she chose to accept her past and embrace her future. Her experience tells us that hardship is not terrible. What is terrible is being defeated by hardship. Desire is not terrible. What is terrible is being consumed by desire. True strength is not about having much wealth and power, but about still being able to adhere to kindness and maintain a love for life and hope after enduring hardships. The revelation of this book for us modern people may be, in this materialistic era, we must learn to keep our original intention, not be consumed by desire, and not be bound by the world. We must understand that happiness is never obtained through wealth and power, but comes from inner peace and freedom, from the warmth and companionship around us. We do not need to blindly chase things that are out of reach, do not need to care too much about the opinions of others, and do not need to force ourselves to live up to the expectations of the world. Learning to accept our imperfections, learning to cherish the people around us, and learning to find happiness in ordinary life. This is perhaps the most precious revelation we can get from Bleak House. At the same time, Bleak House also makes us see that a person's fate is never isolated. It is closely connected to the times. That rigid and corrupt judicial system, that society with a huge gap between the rich and the poor, created countless tragedies. Today, we still need to be vigilant against those rigid systems and unfair phenomena, still need to adhere to justice and kindness, and use our own strength to create a better society. We may not be able to change the whole world, but we can change ourselves, adhere to our bottom line, pass on kindness and warmth, and make this world have less absurdity and pain, and more light and hope. In the book, Dickens used thick fog to symbolize the absurdity and confusion of that era. At the end of the story, the fog lifts, the sun shines, and Esther ushered in her own happiness. This also symbolizes that no matter how dark the times are, no matter how rough fate is, hope will never disappear. As long as we adhere to kindness and hope, we will surely get out of the fog and usher in our own light. In the late night, after listening to this absurd and sad story, you may feel a little heavy, or you may see your own shadow in the story. Bleak House has no gorgeous rhetoric and no happy ending, but with its most authentic writing, it tells the complexity of human nature, the cruelty of the times, and the power of hope. It tells us that life may be full of absurdity and hardship, that we may be consumed by desire and teased by fate, but as long as we adhere to kindness and hope and cherish the warmth around us, we will surely find light in the dark and redemption in hardship. With a story written more than 170 years ago, Dickens tells us an eternal truth. Kindness is never in vain, and hope never fades. No summary can replace the original work. A good book is worth reading page by page. Good night, and wish you a sound sleep tonight. I'm Time for Bed. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to our next encounter.